Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to offer dana, then please do go to justthiszen.org/giving. Your support really does make a huge difference. Thank you so much.
Yes, it's lovely to be with you here this morning. And as I was sitting, I was thinking of something that I've kind of said to clients over the years, which is I was feeling it. I was feeling the power of that I'm here this morning, having had something of a rough night and having some kind of disturbance in myself and feeling absolutely fine, and really glad to be here. And so it's really good to kind of make space to be with all the different things that I'm kind of being with this morning. So, and yes, and I know that recently you've been looking at the Genjo Koan, and listening to it through Domio Burke. And when she was introducing it, I listened to the talks because I was interested, and she talks about how it's open to interpretation and inference and to studying it. And again and again, the sense in which the kind of poetic parts of it, the images, are all part of what we might call, pointing at the moon, and and how obscure it can feel, and how difficult, and how we can have so many different responses to it. And this morning, when I was in the morning, our two cats have trained me to give them treats. So that's the first thing I have to do before I do anything else. I get my own breakfast, is I have to give the cats treats. I'm very well trained, and I put two. We have two cats, and I put two bowls with two lots of treats down in. And if both cats go for one bowl, I can't point to the other bowl. Cats do not follow fingers. You can't point a cat at something. You have to get hold of the bowl and shake it, and then they'll go to it. So I was thinking about that as well, that idea of pointing at the moon. And yet quite often, what we're not looking at the moon at all. We're incredibly busily sort of looking at the finger and looking at the hand, and it can be really hard to even see what's being pointed at. And so I get kind of really curious about what happens to you, and inside, I'm curious about what happens to me when I listen to or read or attend to something like the Genjo Koan, because these things kind of land in us through our own habits of attention. And often for me, if I'm listening to a talk, I'm really listening through the lens of my confirmation bias. I'm filtering, I'm listening for, do I like the speaker? Am I attracted? Sort of like, is there an affinity? Am I enjoying what they're saying? Am I listening for them to confirm what I already know? Or am I listening for a fight? Am I looking for the key? Some of us were taught by the wonderful Donna Martin in Hakomi, and she often used to start a thing by saying, "I'm going to give you the key," and then of course it was never about the key. So are we listening to that? Are we listening for the final piece of the puzzle? Are we listening to confirm our intelligence or our stupidity? It's like, what are we listening for? Encouragement. It's really interesting to just think, not just what is this thing I am listening to, but who is it that's listening? Which part of me is here attending? And You know, and you'll have habit. We all do. We have habits of attention, and it's really interesting to kind of just be noticing what are our habits of attention. What is it we listen? Who listens? And as it says in the Genjo Koan, as you will know, one of its most famous sort of stanzas is, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study even that, who is listening. And when we start to study the self is to forget the self, is to soften those lenses, to really soften the lenses of which we look and attend to the whole of life, not just who we're listening to. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. And when actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. And for me, that this part of studying the self is being aware of not just, who we're listening, who we're attending to, but really this, who is listening. And we'll all have our own particular tendencies. One of mine, who listens, arises from my own love of paradox. I was personally relieved, some years ago when I heard Flint saying something like, if it ain't paradoxical, it ain't true. And I have a kind of system that when I hear that, I just breathe a huge sigh of relief. It feels like, oh, I'm given permission not to be looking for a sort of motorway through life, really well signposted and with great rest stops, hello Gloucester services for some of us. We know that kind of route. But what happens if we appreciate that the way is not this motorway? It's the meanders and the cul-de-sacs and the hiatuses, and seeing them all as part of the backward step we take to study our own infinitely paradoxical self. So studying the Genjo Koan is illuminating, even if it's what is illuminating is our preferences and our biases, our irritation at its obscurity or our delight in its obscurity. It may illuminate our need for a manual, for a straightforward instructions. I've got this incredibly complicated machine of my life, and I want the study notes for it. I don't want some poetic guide that ends up telling me that I'm not actually here anyway. It's a really tricky thing, isn't it? So, before I was reading Buddhist texts, I was much more familiar with the Tao Te Ching, and I always loved this particular passage from it. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The unnameable is the eternally real. Naming is the origin of all particular things. Free from desire, you realize the mystery. Caught in desire, you see only manifestations. Yet mystery and manifestations arise from the same source. This source is called darkness. Darkness within darkness, the gateway to all understanding. That's a particular translation by Stephen Mitchell. And, as I read it now, I'm aware of, the incredible closeness and similarity for me in the way I read it and see it, as I'm now reading something like the Genjo Koan. The mystery and manifestations coming from the same source, and this source is called darkness. And it can be helpful to remember, as Domyo Burke says in this context, we're not thinking about a sort of Judeo-Christian version of darkness being, the antithesis of light, but as darkness as undifferentiated emptiness. the source of all arising. Everything comes from this undifferentiated emptiness. So so for my system, in this version of self which is relieved at paradox, and uh, and I really know that is not the case for all systems. As a therapist, I remember working with a systems engineer. The clue's in the title. And they were kind of really intimately involved. They were really high up and intimately involved with the creation and setting up of a really complex hydroelectric scheme, building a wind farm far out to sea where they had to take into account not just the complexity of what they were building, but the complexity of the movement of the sea. Like the moments when they could get down on the shore and do various things and then pull everything back. It was all tied in with the tides, which are, of course, also shifting. Tides aren't like work rotas, they change all the time. So they were able to do that. They could encompass in their minds this vast, complex web of interaction of sea and work and people's timetables and then the actual machinery that they were building. But they were so frustrated and upset about being human. They did not like it. And a lot of our work together was kind of figuring out that there wasn't a manual, that there were no specific instructions. Turn to page 48 for how you handle deep emotional distress. It's like, it was, honestly, I can't tell you how frustrated they were about the fact that there should be one. And interestingly, for us, if we're studying Buddhism, studying the texts, there is a manual. We sort of have one. There is a manual on being human. Comes with some really pretty pithy instructions. Caught in the self-centered dream, holding to self-centered thoughts. But however much we read these things and study them, and the many amazing commentaries and texts and stories, they can still feel really kind of out there. And I'm sure this is probably the same for you, that, from all the talks that you hear and the reading, particular little sentences or little pieces kind of stick and feel like they land somewhere and they catch. And for me, one of the things that kind of stuck was a phrase that I've used in all sorts of contexts, which was the family treasure doesn't come in the front door. The family treasure doesn't come in the front door. And then, of course, when I went to look this up, I realized it was yet another misremembered version. It's not what it actually says. It's my version. But I was living with that as a kind of pointer it's not the obvious stuff visiting you. It's not the teachings. That's not what comes. And the front door is like our prefrontal cortex, it's our cognitive understanding. It's almost like the stuff comes in the back door, it slides in unobserved, unannounced, maybe even let in by a sort of sneaky servant, and you don't even quite know it's there. And for me, that fitted really nicely with my kind of lens of, it's not just our prefrontal cortex, it's not just our conscious minds that's working with all of this, it's also our non-conscious that's actually hugely involved in kind of engaging with all this stuff. The actual phrase is kind of different. Haven't you heard that what comes in through the front gate is not the family treasure? That's a really different phrase. Haven't you heard that what comes in through the front gate is not the family treasure? So, this is kind of what I was wanting to explore with you, is how we listen, how we receive, how we attend to the words of others. and to recognize that what's coming in the front gate is not the family treasure, but how it works inside of you to reveal your own treasure. What's actually already there is the treasure. And we can spend so much time poring over the words of others. And of course, in our paradoxical world, that's a wonderful and relevant activity of our practice. Something like the Genjo Koan is so illuminating in how another practitioner is pointing at the moon. And many practitioners have had the experiences and opening to the realities that support us as sentient beings, that help us awaken. To awaken to true mind. We read to support that awakening. We study to support that awakening. And for me, when I can relax any of my filters that are getting in the way of opening to what's being shared, then the treasure becomes mine. I'm not just rifling through what's been collected before, which of course is also treasure. So in pondering on these sorts of thoughts, I read the following story, so I'm going to give you a story from someone else, which has become part of my treasure. And the story is called Cut Through. There's a story about Seppo and his brother monk, Ganto, who were travelling down together when there was a terrible snowstorm that came along. And as the snow came down and the drifts rose, they decided to wait it out at an inn. And of course, in 9th century China, there were no snow plows, so waiting it out meant relinquishing all plans and schedules. During that time of relinquishment, Ganto spent every day sleeping. Seppo diligently sitting. He kept to his schedule. And Seppo grew disgusted with Ganto and cried, "Elder brother, come on, get up." "Why should I?" said Ganto. Seppo muttered, "Why am I so unlucky to be travelling with a guy who just drags me down? Ever since we got here, he's done nothing. He's done nothing but sleep." And Ganto shouted at him, "Every day since we got here, you've been sitting there like a stone Buddha. What's the matter with you?" Seppo was taken aback and his criticism changed to introspection. And he said, "Within myself I feel no peace. Within myself I feel no peace. I dare not deceive myself." And the author of the piece I was reading went on to say, there is a saying, self-deceit is a strong fort. We must have this kind of honesty in our practice. Resistance comes, willfulness comes, arrogance comes, emotion comes, ambition, laziness. Seeing these conditions arise, we must return over and over to the breath. Anyway, the story continues. Seppo honestly owned up to feeling no peace. And because of that honesty, Ganto was able to use skillful means. He asked him, "Tell me about your experiences up until this point. Maybe I can help you see what is genuine in your practice and what is an impediment." Seppo proceeded to tell Ganto how he had gotten some understanding from this teacher's talk and some insight from that teacher's verse, and how he had questioned Tokusan about the great vehicle beyond vehicles and was struck by him and still didn't get it. And Ganto cried, "Haven't you heard that what comes in through the front gate is not the family treasure? Haven't you heard that what comes in through the front gate is not the family treasure?" Seppo then asked, "Well, what should I do?" And Ganto replied, from now on, if you want to be capable of true insight and become a great teacher, let everything flow forth from your own heart-mind. Then it will cover heaven and earth. Let everything flow through from your own heart mind, then it will cover heaven and earth. At this, Seppo was thoroughly awakened. He eventually became the abbot at a monastery with 1,500 monks, and was the abbot of Uman and Hogan, and founded 2 of the 5 schools of Zen. He stopped being a stone Buddha and became a living one. How do you listen to your mind, your life, with this heart mind? What family treasure are you sifting through, loading it in through the front door, trying to make sense of your ancestors' belongings as though they had the key to how you live your life right now? And of course, they do. You know, these old stories are pointing at something. They're pointing at the moon. They are the way that we as sentient beings can help and support each other to waken up to true mind. They create the fertile conditions for our way-seeking minds to open to the possibilities of being in the absolute here of the relative, to being fully here in the absolute here of the relative, a really bad night, quite a lot of distress, and absolutely fine. How can we be here with all of that? And I was thinking about, if you go walking in the hills, there are times when the cloud is so low, that you're in the cloud, you're actually in the cloud, and you can't see the cloud anymore. But the many, many fine droplets of moisture are slowly penetrating, until without standing in the rain, we are quietly soaked. Quietly and fully soaked. And I think for me, my practice has been like sitting in the cloud. I haven't got a clue what's going on most of the time. I have no idea about the edges of this. But the act of sitting again and again with friends in all the many different states that I've been in, all the many different lenses that I've looked through, I've been soaked in the teachings, as we all are, soaked in the way. So for me, there is a kind of surrender to this, a surrender to sitting in Zazen. We have so many strivings, so many yearnings. And of course, all these states will happen, quiet mind, open mind, closed mind, hurting heart, soft heart, things dropping away, things piling in. But what also happens is if we can keep meeting ourselves and keep on meeting and meeting, the many lenses that we see and experience through become visible and in time permeable. And we see their impermanence. And when that grip of permanence loosens, we see that there's no separate self. And the world becomes a fluid place to be in. And we see the moon and the finger pointing at the moon, and the clouds, and the birds, and the wind. And they all have their right expression, and they're all the treasure of our own heart minds. Thank you for being with me this morning.